Hi, I'm Hal Roberts. This is Bridge City News. Here's some of the top stories we've been following. Thousands of Ukrainians are fleeing their country as the Russian invasion continues. A large rally in support of the people of Ukraine is being planned at Lethbridge City Hall on Saturday. And the province is promising a break on natural gas and electricity bills. Lethbridge East MLA Nathan Newdorf discusses details of the recent budget and the help Albertans can look forward to.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Roberts.
Thanks so much for joining us. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky says 137 civilians and military personnel have been killed in his country on the first day of the Russian invasion. He called them heroes and says 316 others have also been injured. Russian troops are bearing down on Ukraine's capital with tanks, gunfire, and explosions resonating ever closer to Kiev. Casualty numbers continue to rise from the deadly warfare. There are growing signs that Vladimir Putin's Russia may be seeking to overthrow Ukraine's government. NATO has demanded Russia to withdraw all of its forces. Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary are just a few countries mobilizing to receive thousands upon thousands of Ukrainians fleeing the Russian invasion. Cars are backed up for several kilometers at some border crossings. There are people who are also leaving everything behind and riding their bicycles to the nearest border.
Mit lehet, mikor az egész életünk munkája. Az életünk munkája, mindent ott kell hagyni, de csak oda is lejössz az udvarról. Bele lehet abba gondolni, hogy mit lehet érezni.
The UN Refugee Agency is estimating that more than 100,000 Ukrainians have left their homes and that up to 4 million may flee to other countries if the situation continues to escalate. An expert in international trade thinks world leaders are reluctant to cut Russia off from the SWIFT system of financial transactions. Officials from the European Centre for International Political Economy say that would be considered the nuclear option of sanctions. They say the move would have major economic costs for Western countries because if Russia was cut off from foreign payments for its oil and gas, it would start expropriating the 300 billion euros that EU investors have plowed into the country. Canadian phone companies are waiving long-distance and text charges for calls to Ukraine over Russia's assault on the country. Bell, Rogers, TELUS, and Shaw have all announced customers will not be charged to connect with loved ones in the embattled region. Rogers and its subsidiary, Fido Solutions, say roaming fees for clients in Ukraine will also be set aside until the end of March. David Marples, a professor of Russian and Eastern history at the University of Alberta, says when it comes to Russian aggression, Vladimir Putin is wanting total control of Ukraine.
It's a democratic state which has determined its own direction, and that direction is not the same direction that Russia has been pursuing since Putin took power, which has been to reverse a lot of the things that happened back in the early 1990s, and for Russia to restore its position as a regional power and then ultimately as a global power by not necessarily reintegrating the Soviet Union, but certainly forming close ties with the states like Belarus and Ukraine that it considers to be part of its own sphere of interest.
Catch the full interview with U of A professor David Marples and BCN's Jeanette Rocher coming up later in our show. Lethbridge City Hall will play host to a Ukraine Solidarity Rally Saturday morning at 11. Event organizer Devin Hargreaves is inviting people to bring a Ukrainian flag to show support for Ukrainians dealing with the Russian invasion. Lethbridge Mayor Blaine Higgins says this is a vital way to show solidarity.
Actually, you know, one of the first things when we'd seen this, what was happening over there, and my heart goes out to all of those here locally that have family back there, as well as just our community and the support for Ukraine. We did have a request and regarding lighting of City Hall, and unfortunately, I was had requested to have that done, but we have an issue with our lighting up City Hall, so we're looking into all other options at this time, and I'm hoping to have something back sooner than later.
In 1991, Canada became the first Western nation to recognize Ukraine's independence. Well, we enjoyed much milder temperatures here in southwestern Alberta today, and not a bad weekend is shaping up either so far. Jeanette Rocher is here now with an early peek at the forecast. Jeanette, will the warmer temperatures be sticking around?
Yeah, they sure will be, Hal, because we're looking at plus temperatures into the weekend with some 70-kilometer-per-hour wind gusts. But you know what? I will take the wind because that means we're going to have those plus temperatures. We're looking at double digits even into next week and up to the teen temperatures before dropping again into the minuses. Definitely feels like spring because that's when we have that crazy fluctuation in temperature. I'll have more details coming up for you later on in the newscast.
Thanks so much, Jeanette. Well, we have more details now on the balanced Alberta budget. In fact, government officials say we now have a $500 million surplus compared to a $3.2 billion deficit in the last budget. The province says Alberta Health will be seeing an infusion of $600 million this year and will grow by a total of $1.8 billion by 2024-2025 in order to scale up capacity. Officials say there will also be an extra $100 million, with some of the funding going towards new intensive care unit beds, which they say will lead to reduced surgery wait times. The budget also included a $750 million contingency, which will help address the surgical backlog. Just over $170 million over 3 years will expand student enrollment in areas with skills shortages. Around 7,000 post-secondary seats will be created in areas including healthcare, engineering, aviation, and computer science. The opposition NDP says the budget fails to address the needs of families burdened by high energy bills, hefty insurance premiums, and higher fees for school, tuition, and camping.
I was shocked, really quite shocked, that this government put nothing in this budget to help with the sky-high bills that Albertans are paying right now. Not a cent. For both gas and electricity, Albertans are on their own this winter, and very likely they'll be on their own next. The UCP's alleged gas rate bait only applies next winter, and even then, it only kicks in at $6.50 a gigajoule, a rate that their own budget says we will never reach.
Well, Lethbridge East MLA and UCP caucus chair Nathan Newdorf says with the new tabled budget, Albertans can expect to see a little relief on their bills, including those natural gas and electric bills.
We have two bills that I'm aware of. One is to address natural gas prices, a rebate system very similar to what Ralph Klein brought in 2006, where if costs go too high, there will be a rebate. That will have some security for those individuals. And there's also a bill in the works to help with electricity supply so that we can increase supply of electricity to our grid, therefore hopefully lowering prices for consumers.
MLA Newdorf will also offer an update on how the Kenney government is addressing the doctor shortage here in our province. That full interview is coming up in the second half of our broadcast. Lethbridge Mayor Blaine Hagan gave a thumbs up to the Alberta budget. One issue that has been discussed for our region is the potential of a new third bridge being built in our city. During the last municipal election, over 60% of voters said yes to building a third bridge prior to 2030. The estimated cost would be between $175 and $200 million. Higgins says he's heard that the province knows the city could potentially be looking into building a third bridge, and there are options on the table as to where the money comes from.
Is it a possibility it could be more of a regional bridge? What are some of those opportunities? What do they look like if it's not inside Lethbridge, if it's maybe outside Lethbridge? And so we're looking at all these options. But absolutely, as I've said numerous times, I would not ever support a bridge on the back of hike that looks in taxation. Would never support that. So absolutely, looking at all options, speaking with the province and the federal government for that matter. And we hope that we can have something coming forward.
Now, if the city was footing the bill for the new bridge, Higgins says that could potentially mean a municipal tax increase of 9 to 11%, totaling up to 2.75% per year for 4 years. The province could be looking to make privatized healthcare more available for Albertans, which could significantly reduce waiting times for surgical procedures. However, the Alberta Union of Provincial Employees, which represents many healthcare workers, isn't happy with that proposal. Vice President Susan Slade says privatization could affect the jobs of their members.
It greatly affects our members. Of course, we still have that threat looming over our members within Alberta Health Services of the cuts that are being proposed there. Food services, the retail foods have already been on the chopping block. Our laundry services, of course, that's affected Lethbridge and Medicine Hat. Those went to a private industry, but it is continuing care. We do have a lot of for-profit and private facilities that we're that we have members in. However, though, we see that the model that they use, those operators, they don't have full-time care, or they don't have full-time jobs, sorry. So they're not stable jobs. There's a lot of turnover. And what it does is it makes people have to work multiple jobs.
You can catch more of that interview with the AUPE's Susan Slade and BCN's Jeanette Rocher on the weekend edition of Bridge City News. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation says the recently tabled budget is moving the province in the right direction. The Alberta director of the CTF, Kevin Lacey, says there were a couple of things about the budget he liked, besides the fact that it's balanced along with a $500 million surplus.
Well, there were two things I think are important for taxpayers. The first is that we began to slow the growth of spending. So between 2004 and 2018, we saw spending go up in the province 144%. That's a lot, about 9% a year. And now this begins to slow that down to about a little over 3% for the term of the government. And that allows us to balance the budget. So I think that's the first thing that's key. And the reason that's important for those people who are watching tonight and for Albertans is because when you begin to pay down the debt, that gives you less money you have to pay in interest payments, which is more money for healthcare, education, and things that really matter. The second is the spending that was in this budget was targeted. So normally they just throw money out the door on major bundles, but this they actually targeted to specific things that would help the Alberta economy. And I thought it was innovative and a good approach by the government.
A downtown Lethbridge business said they have simply had enough after falling victim to several break-ins and robberies. As BCN's Angela Stewart explains now, the King of Trade says thanks to the help of the BRZ, they will be increasing security.
The big loss is the damage to property that we have and the time it takes to fix that.
Broken windows, shattered glass casings, and stolen merchandise. These are just some of the things the King of Trade has been dealing with following a string of break-ins and robberies.
It's tough these days. You know, we have just as small businesses struggled through 2 years of COVID. We're just struggling to tread water. And these are just an added insult to us, really.
Over the last 12 months, King of Trade has been hit with a total of 5 break-ins and robberies. Owner Hunter Hagee says the brunt of it all is the property damage.
The theft itself is smaller than the damage that they cause. They break a window, they break some showcases, and that'll be several $1,000s of damage, and then they steal $500 worth of stuff.
The only avenue that they see that they can go down now is that of roll shuttering.
A program that's offered through the city and the downtown BRZ. Businesses are able to apply for a grant, with the money being allocated towards upping security measures.
Maybe increased lighting, motion sensor lighting, surveillance cameras. So there is that program that is being taken advantage of by a number of the by the business owners.
We've applied for that already and received some funding.
Hagee says the main priority right now is making sure his store is protected.
You know, it's not going to stop break-ins. What'll happen, unfortunately, it'll stop break-ins at my store. We're not solving the problem, we're just pushing it on to somebody else, unfortunately, but that's the reality of it. We have to look after ourselves and look after our own businesses down here, and that's what we're doing.
For Bridge City News, I'm Angela Stewart.
A man was injured after being shot by a Coaldale RCMP officer around 5 p.m. yesterday. Police say the incident occurred at a home in Picture Butte. RCMP say police went to arrest an individual, and when they arrived, the suspect was holding a weapon. A confrontation occurred where the officer discharged their weapon. The male suspect was taken to hospital with non-life-threatening injuries. The police officer did not sustain any injuries. ACERT has been brought in to investigate the incident. Beginning Monday, more travelers will be able to take to the sky as more restrictions have been eased by the Canadian government. Ottawa's adjusted its travel health notice from a level 3 to a level 2. That means Canadians are no longer required to avoid non-essential travel. As Micah Quinn explains now, the folks at AMA Travel Alberta believe this is a huge win for the travel industry.
It's been very exciting the last couple of weeks. We've seen our call volume double compared to the same time last year.
Nicola Berube, the Director of Sales from AMA Travel Alberta, says the organization has reached its highest call volume in close to 2 years. This is coming off the heels of the Canadian government announcing that on February 28th, on-air testing for fully vaccinated travelers will be eased. This means travelers arriving to Canada who are vaccinated will be randomly selected for arrival testing. Travelers will not have to quarantine as well.
The hotspots are Mexico, all-inclusives, California, Disney, even into Las Vegas has picked up a lot. Hawaii is really big right now.
Also included in the easing of restrictions is that children under 12 years old that are traveling with fully vaccinated adults will not have to quarantine, meaning they will no longer have to wait 14 days before attending school, camp, or daycare. Unvaccinated travelers will continue to be tested upon arrival, as well as day 8, and will have to quarantine for 14 days. Unvaccinated foreign travelers will not be able to get into Canada unless they meet one of the exemptions.
These changes are possible, not only because we have passed the peak of Omicron, but because Canadians across the country have listened to the science and to experts, followed the public health measures, and taken steps to protect themselves, their families, and their communities.
Travelers now have the option of using a COVID-19 rapid antigen test taken the day before a scheduled flight, or a molecular test result that has to be taken no more than 72 hours before their flight or arrival at the land border or marine port of entry. Taking a rapid antigen test at home is not enough to meet the pre-entry requirement. For Bridge City News, I'm Micah Quinn.
Yes, it would be nice to sneak away somewhere tropical right now. Well, it was nice to enjoy some milder temperatures here in Lethbridge, and not a bad weekend is shaping up either. Full weather details are on deck. Well, we hovered around the freezing mark for much of the day today, but the mercury will be climbing by quite a bit over the next few days. Jeanette Rocher is here now with a complete look at the weather forecast. Jeanette, we should expect lots of sunshine this weekend and hopefully double-digit plus temperatures next week.
Yeah, not just double digits of 10 or 11. We're talking we could see up to the teens into next week. Look at that temperature on Thursday. We're going to be keeping our eye on that because that could be close to a record-breaking day. Into tomorrow, Saturday, we're looking at sunshine, 7 degrees. So we're popping right up into those pluses again. Sunday, also 7. Monday, looking at the double digits, starting there, 11 degrees up to 14 on Tuesday, down to 3 on Wednesday. And look what happens next Thursday. We're going to plummet back down to -4 with a chance of snow. So like I was saying earlier, definitely springtime feeling in the air because that's when you get those crazy fluctuations in temperatures. Not quite spring yet. Does feel like it though. Average high for this time of year, 3. We're going to be hitting well above that this weekend. Average low, -10. 19 was our high temperature back in 1992. And 94, we were sitting at -33 degrees. That's kind of yucky for this time of year, especially. 7:22 is when the sun rose this morning. Our sun set this evening at 6:06 p.m., giving us well over 10 hours of daylight. Okay, let's see what's happening on the West Coast tomorrow. We are looking at temperatures of 6 degrees in both Vancouver and Victoria. Both of those cities seeing showers as well. -3 the high in Edmonton tomorrow with a mix of sun and cloud. Calgary seeing a lovely high of 7 degrees and a little bit of those Chinook winds as well. Somewhat like Lethbridge there as we look to the rest of the prairies. Taking us to Saskatoon, -7 the high. Chance of flurries there. We're also going to see some flurries tomorrow in Regina. -5 the high there, -5. Also the high in Winnipeg with flurries. Winnipeg and Regina, as you can see, out of that extreme cold warning, but still looking at some wind chill there as well. Toronto tomorrow, -1 rather the high there. -3 the high in Ottawa tomorrow, and -4 will be the high in Montreal tomorrow, with lots of sunshine there. As we look further east into Atlantic Canada, let's see what the Maritimes are up to tomorrow. -6 the high in Fredericton with flurries tomorrow. Halifax looking at sunshine, -5. Sunny skies in Charlottetown tomorrow, -9, and -8 tomorrow in St. John's, Newfoundland, with flurries expected there as well. So there you have it. That is your forecast.
World leaders continue to slap heavy sanctions on Russia's economy as the Russian invasion of Ukraine continues. In near unison, Canada, the United States, and 27 European Union allies announced a round of punitive measures against Russian banks and leading companies. They've also imposed export controls aimed at starving the Kremlin's industries and military of semiconductors and other high-tech products. Drug maker Johnson & Johnson, along with 3 large U.S. drug distributors, agreed to finalize a proposed $26 billion settlement. It resolves claims made by states and local governments that they help fuel the U.S. opioid epidemic.
It's the largest settlement and is likely to remain the largest settlement in the huge constellation of government lawsuits over opioids. Besides Johnson & Johnson, the three other companies involved in this settlement are the U.S.'s biggest drug wholesalers. They are AmerisourceBergen, Cardinal Health, and McKesson.
The deal aims to resolve around 3,000 lawsuits seeking to hold the companies responsible for an opioid abuse crisis that led to hundreds of thousands of overdose deaths in the United States over the past 20 years. Ottawa says its deficit for last April through December was 3.5 times lower than in the same period the previous year. The Finance Department says the deficit was $70.1 billion in the first 9 months of the current fiscal year. That compares with a deficit of $248.2 billion for the same period a year earlier. Program expenses, excluding net actuarial losses, declined 25% to $322 billion, and revenue was up 34% to $278.3 billion. Canfor Corporation signed a letter of intent to sell its forest tenure in the Mackenzie region of British Columbia to 2 First Nations groups. The Vancouver-based company says the sale of its rights to manage the first and harvest timber is subject to approval by the province. Canfor has also agreed to sell its Mackenzie site, plant and equipment to Peak Renewables. The combined price of the 2 agreements is $70 million. Now, here's a look at today's markets. The TSX was up 344 points in the day to 21,106. The Dow was up 834 points to 34,058. The S&P 500 was up 95 points to 4384, and the Nasdaq was up 221 on the day to 13,694. West Texas Intermediate Oil was down $1.22 to 91.59 US per barrel. Natural gas was down 17 cents to 4.47 US. Gold was down $14.55 on the day to 18.8934 US an ounce, and silver was up 6 cents to 24.27 US an ounce. Feed wheat is at $11.84 per bushel, barley's at $9.47, canola's at $22.75, and corn is at $11.18 per bushel. Live cattle were down $1.25 to 139.28. Feeder cattle were up 93 cents to 160.03, and lean hogs were down $1.85 to 103.68. The Canadian dollar was up slightly over the past 24 hours to 78.73 US. Recapping one of our top stories, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky says 137 civilians and military personnel have been killed in his country on the first day of the Russian invasion. He called them heroes and says 316 other people have also been injured. The recent Alberta budget has been tabled and some rebates are coming for Albertans. UCP Caucus Chair and Lethbridge East MLA Nathan Neudorf will have details for us in just a moment. The Alberta budget was recently tabled. Finance Minister Travis Taves proudly announced in the budget that, you know what, it's balanced. In fact, we even have a surplus. To discuss this in more detail and what this means for Albertans is Lethbridge East MLA and UCP Caucus Chair Nathan Neudorf. Nathan, before we chat about the budget, let's talk about, first of all, what's happening in Ukraine and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The world is watching how it's all unfolding. Do you think sanctions will be enough to have Russian President Vladimir Putin pull his troops back?
I'm concerned that sanctions won't be enough, Hal. He seems to have been developing this plan over 8 to 10 years. This is something that his comments have been building towards for a long time. I don't think he's going to be turned away by some mere sanctions. I fear that we'll have to increase our presence from the West and NATO, United Nations forces to really put some pressure on Russia to stop this aggression.
Amazing to see how it unfolds here. And what's scary now as well is some of the Russian propaganda that's floating out there, saying that the reason why Russia's invading Ukraine is because they're attacking the American biolabs that are set up instead of just a true power grab. So it's kind of scary, the misinformation that's floating around, especially on social media right now.
It's very concerning, and I'm very sad for the people of Ukraine, for their families, and you may not know this, Hal, but Alberta has the largest grouping of people of Ukraine descent in all of Canada. It's a very tightly tied community to Ukraine, and we really feel for those people and their families and those with family members there who may be hurt or even killed by this aggression. So we just call on all partners to stand in solidarity with Ukraine to see the stop to these actions.
No, you're right. I do know I have a number of friends in Edmonton and Vegreville of Ukrainian descent, and you're right, we do have a strong Ukrainian contingency in Alberta. So, yeah, let's pray that things do work out and that Russia does pull back. Now, let's circle back to the budget here for just a moment. Finance Minister Travis Toews released details of the new budget, and we're back in black. But how will a balanced budget really help Albertans moving forward?
Well, I think a balanced budget does a tremendous amount of good for all Albertans, not just on a credit rating, but it just inspires investor confidence. That is a huge part of why we were able to balance is we had so much private investment from film and technology, agriculture, agri-food products, technology. I could go on, finance, all these areas of private industry saw that influx. That's there because they have confidence that the government is doing the right things to get their fiscal house in order. And I think that's where we'll see it most predominantly across Alberta and specifically here in Lethbridge.
Now, Nathan, some critics of the UCP say it really wasn't the work of your party that helped to balance the books, but more attributed to the price of oil, which is now north of $90 US per barrel. How would you respond to that?
I say absolutely that there is a huge part of the budget that was able to be balanced because of our natural resources and the price being as high as they were. But the budget wasn't tabled with $90 a barrel oil. It was tabled with, I believe it was $68 or $70 a barrel oil, a very conservative measure. And the fact remains that when we took over the government of Alberta, the trajectory of spending from budget to budget was on a 4% increase per annum per year. If that trajectory had been maintained, we would be tabling, even at current oil prices, a budget of a deficit of $6 billion, which is very much in line with what we saw with the previous administration. So we did have to take corrective measures. You can go to some of the areas where they received some of those pullbacks on spending, whether it's our post-secondaries here in Lethbridge or municipalities. They felt the pinch. They've had to make some significant adjustments, and we thank them for those efforts to help us get to the place we are today with a balanced budget being tabled.
Now, the price of groceries, heating costs, fuel for our vehicles simply going through the roof. What help is there in the budget for Albertans right now, Nathan?
Yeah, this has been a trend that I've been advocating to be looked at for about 2 years, the cost of inflation and currency devaluation. Very concerned about that, especially for our fixed income seniors and others who are on fixed income. It's very troubling for them. We hear a lot about it, and I have been advocating for that response for some time. We have two bills that I'm aware of. One is to address natural gas prices, a rebate system very similar to what Ralph Klein brought in 2006, where if costs go too high, there'll be a rebate. That will have some security for those individuals. And there's also a bill in the works to help with electricity supply so that we can increase supply of electricity to our grid, therefore hopefully lowering prices for consumers. We wish we could do a little bit more faster. As with so many things, it may take some time to get these engaged and implemented, but we are addressing these problems in a significant way, and I hope that it provides some assurance for those on fixed income.
The Albertans really need the brakes right now, especially when it comes to natural gas and electricity, so hopefully it can be implemented this year and not next year. Now, Finance Minister Travis Toews says a large focus of the budget was also on health care. Now, Nathan, does that mean the province is going to address the doctor shortage here in our province, including right here in Lethbridge?
Absolutely. That's a huge part of what we're doing with Alberta Health Services is to capture, attract and retain doctors. And some really good news I'm expecting for Lethbridge, an area where I know offers have been extended to at least 2 doctors, and up to 20 more have been interviewed and reviewed in part of that process. So that's very positive news. I hope for a further announcement from the Minister of Health in the next few weeks for Lethbridge specifically in that regard to where we've come addressing that, not just for the province, but specifically for here in Lethbridge, a key part of the budget for me and the residents in Lethbridge who are without a family doctor at this time.
Now, are these Canadian doctors we chatted with, or maybe doctors outside of the province or even the country?
I would say that there would be a good blend of all of that. We have a very limited supply of doctors that we train here in Alberta, and I propose some ideas moving forward of how we can increase that number and increase how many are trained here in Lethbridge or in rural or less metro sites, but a good many of them would come from further afield, whether that's from outside of Alberta within Canada, or whether that would be internationally. But I think people have less concern once their credentials are verified where a doctor comes from and practices, as long as they are able to get a family doctor. I think that's what they would like to see first.
Now, I was recently chatting with former Lethbridge Mayor Chris Spearman, who says the province really needs to do more to invest here in our region, in southwestern Alberta. He says the federal government is, but not so much the Kenney government. So Nathan, let me ask you something. What have you heard? What kind of investments can we really look forward to seeing in Lethbridge in 2022? Maybe help with a third bridge?
I worked very closely with Chris Spearman while he was still a mayor, and we achieved all 5 of the top asks of the city of Lethbridge: Exhibition Park, extended maintenance for the University of Lethbridge, airport expansion, Highway 3 development, and broadband. So that doesn't include what else our government has invested in the area: irrigation, a new school on the west side, dollars for research, huge investment in mental health and addictions. I look forward to the capital plan specifics being released in the next few days or maybe a week or two to see what's on there specifically for Lethbridge. We have been tremendously blessed in the past year or so, and we'll see a lot of those projects continue this year, but I'm looking for a few new things going forward.
The province recently struck a deal with our nurses. Nathan, how important was that for Alberta?
I think it was really important. Nurses in particular have just worked incredibly hard over the past 2 years for the pandemic, obviously extremely tired, on the verge, many feeling burnt out. They've worked very, very hard. So for them to be recognized and receive some compensation for that, and I believe their vote was 87% in favor of ratifying that agreement. And as I understand it, the UNA president, Heather Smith, her quote was, "This will benefit our members and is fair to the people of Alberta." So to be able to get a win-win situation like that with one of our largest unions, our frontline workers, and workers who have literally put their lives on the line for 2 years during this pandemic, I think is a tremendous sign of positivity, of hope, and a sigh of relief for many, to tell you the truth.
Now, your wife is a nurse as well, correct? What were her thoughts on this deal? What did she have to tell you?
Yeah. Yeah, she is a frontline emergency room nurse, and I think she was pleased as well. I don't think many people look forward to the opportunity or the requirement to possibly have to go through strike action or those kind of hard negotiation tactics. I think she was relieved that an agreement was able to be come to much more cooperatively, and one, like I said, that was a win-win for both sides, where the province is happy moving forward, fair to the citizens of Alberta who are the taxpayers, and fair to his members, supported by 87% of them. I think that would speak volumes to her.
Now, even though the Emergencies Act was revoked, Premier Jason Kenney said his government is still going to pursue legal action against the Trudeau Liberals over invoking the act. Why bother involving the courts if it's been revoked?
Well, I think the key point on this point, Hal, is that the action happened. The government invoked an incredibly powerful act and could have carried on with that if there wasn't such a pushback to revoke it. So that action took place. And I think what our government, our premier, is seeking to do is provide further clarification on the thresholds required to ever invoke those kind of powers again. Those powers are incredibly significant. They shouldn't be taken lightly. And if they're not going to be listening to the citizenship of Canada in invoking those, we definitely need the courts to define the parameters in which they would be able to do so to protect the citizens of the country for their liberties and freedoms, and define that more clearly in the court of law.
Now, what are your thoughts of the Freedom Convoy, which took place recently in Ottawa, and the number of protesters who blocked our borders, including here in Alberta at the Coutts border crossing? As you may have seen, it wasn't just truckers protesting the COVID-19 mandates at Coutts, but farmers as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a significant point, Hal, it's not just one group. I think there's many groups represented, And as a Southern Alberta MLA, I want to be clear that I do not support the federal vaccine mandate for truckers. And I do unequivocally support the right of anybody to protest peacefully. And I think I would underscore the word peacefully. And I commit to advocate on those views presented for those who are my constituents. But I would encourage anybody who previously in the past or was engaged with those not to engage in any unlawful activity. I think that's a threshold that, as part of the legislative process, part of government, I can't support unlawful or illegal activities. And I think when you don't have a homogenous group, where you have groups that are made up of many other subgroups, those different messages can damage the primary message or what they're set to accomplish. And that also is a nuance that makes it difficult for people in my role to fully support or fully disagree with the protest taking place.
March 1st, the province is looking at lifting more of the mandates, including no longer having to wear the face masks. How important is this for Albertans to, as Premier Kenney says, to learn to simply live with COVID-19?
I think it's very important. I think in the past month or so, we've seen a tremendous shift in the attitude of the broad majority of Albertans. Many of us have been feeling fatigue of the restrictions for some time. I think that's fair to say. And I think within the last month, with some other things happening, we've really felt the strain of those restrictions. And it is now time, with our numbers really dropping in a very positive way, it is a time to get back to normal in measured steps. And I think we're taking those measured steps. Some would have liked to have seen that a long time ago. Some would like to see that to take its time a little bit longer, but I think we're taking those measured steps to get people back to normal, allow them to get back to their lives, earn an income again, and enjoy the positive news that we have on an economic front in a much more fulsome way.
A number of schools said no thank you to the province for testing out the new curriculum. I believe around only 7 schools said yes. Why do you think the number was so low, and what changes were made whereby most Albertans would potentially be on board? Is there more of a focus on our Indigenous communities, perhaps?
Yeah, I think there's a number of issues in there. Again, we have a very diverse province. We have a range of views all across the province. We have 2 defined metros. We have a huge rural population, and then we have the mid-sized cities somewhere in the middle on a range of perspectives there as well. So we heard a lot of feedback over the last year, and maybe a little bit more. And since September of 2021, approximately 360 teachers have been piloting that K-6 draft curriculum with about 7,800 students across the province. So a lot more than where we first started. And Alberta Education also agreed to pause certain segments of that curriculum and focus more closely on the English language arts and literature, mathematics, physical education, and wellness for the 2022 implementation. Those other topics have been held back until some more work can be put into them, such as First Nations, Métis, and Inuit learning, as well as Francophone perspectives. And that all would come under the heading of the social studies curriculum. I think with that slight change, really in what we were hearing from the large population in Alberta, has really changed that acceptance level and really moved ahead the willingness to implement much of that curriculum this September. And I think that's going to result in a much more positive outcome for everyone involved: teachers, students, parents, and the population in general.
Lethbridge East MLA and UCP Caucus Chair Nathan Neudorf, thanks so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hal.
The Russian invasion of Ukraine has everyone watching Europe right now, and it has some people a little bit on edge. Joining me to discuss this and provide some analysis is Dr. David Marples, who is a university professor of Russian and Eastern European history at the Department of History and Classics at the University of Alberta. Dr. Marples joins me now. Thanks so much for coming on the show today, David. Appreciate having you.
You're very welcome. Nice to chat.
Can you maybe tell us if this military action by Russia is anything new, or is it a continuation of a historic conflict? How far back does the conflict between Russia and Ukraine go?
Well, I think it's something quite new because it's nothing like the scale of this has happened before. If you want to go back to previous centuries, I think you're talking about a time when the nation state didn't really exist. And in the 20th century, maybe the time when the Bolsheviks took power and the Russian Civil War was taking place in Ukraine. And ultimately, a Soviet Ukraine was founded by the Bolsheviks in the city of Kharkiv. I can't really think back to anything else other than maybe in the Second World War. But at that time, most of the Ukrainian soldiers were fighting in the Red Army. But in the western part of Ukraine, there were guerrillas resisting Soviet rule in the period from about 1944 to 50. But there's no precedent for what's happening today. This is a full-scale invasion of one state by another. And supposedly they are fraternal people, right? This is Putin's claim that Ukrainians and Russians are from the same stock. And if that's true, it makes even less sense that you would see an attack like this taking place.
Mm-hmm. So there is some political rhetoric going around that this military action between Russia and Ukraine is an attempt by Vladimir Putin to destabilize the powers in Europe. What do you say about this suggestion?
Well, Putin has always looked for opportunities to divide EU members, for example. And he's formed close relationships with the Hungarian president, Mr. Orban. He's also been on pretty good terms with Germany for most of his time in office, and especially as a trading economic partner. But he's not really tried to undermine Europe per se. I think his focus is particularly on Ukraine and the fact that Ukraine is moving out of the Russian orbit and would prefer to be associated with European structures, and more recently, a member of the NATO alliance. I mean, that's a legitimate question. I think if you're dealing with a Central European state of 44 million people, but at the same time, it's a democratic state which has determined its own direction. And that direction is not the same direction that Russia has been pursuing since Putin took power, which has been to reverse a lot of the things that happened back in the early 1990s, and for Russia to restore its position as a regional power and then ultimately as a global power by not necessarily reintegrating the Soviet Union, but certainly forming close ties with the states like Belarus and Ukraine that it considers to be part of its own sphere of interest. But in every case, I would say that all the institutions that Russia's developed since 1991 have been Russian-controlled. Things like the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union, the Russia-Belarus Union, all these are under close Russian control. And Ukraine is not part of any of them, and has shown no desire to be part of them.
Right. It's interesting that you bring up Belarus, because we're hearing that Russian troops have passed through Belarus to enter Ukraine. So what is the historic connection there between Russia and Belarus versus Ukraine?
Well, all three states in the Soviet period were regarded as the East Slavic states that are the founders of modern-day Russia. The Ukrainian argument would be exactly the opposite, that the Kievan state, which accepted Christianity back in the 10th century, was an exclusively Ukrainian state and is the forerunner of today's Ukraine. Russia, including Vladimir Putin, is claiming that Russia, Belarus, Ukraine are all the same people. They're all from that same root in Kiev back in the 10th century. And therefore, there should be no difference between them. And Belarus, under Alexander Lukashenko, who's been in power since 1994, have been traditionally much closer to Russia. Most of the country is Russian-speaking. But in 2020, in the election there, Lukashenko was challenged by a popular candidate, female candidate, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who, according to all accounts, won that election. And yet Lukashenko announced that he'd won with 80% of the vote. And that was followed by mass demonstrations that went on for months in Belarus. So Belarus did unravel considerably, but Lukashenko had managed to stay in power by using security forces and the threat of Russian intervention, and Russia taking over much of the foreign policy of Belarus. So the two are now in line, but you could also say that the population of Belarus is traditionally been friendly with Ukraine. And I would say they've probably got quite a lot in common even today. Most of Belarus does not like its president and resent what Putin is doing in Ukraine as well.
Interesting. Now, how far do you think this conflict will go? Will other countries get involved? I've heard some even say that we could be on the brink of World War III. Is it that serious?
Well, I was listening to President Biden, and he said on no account would NATO forces enter this conflict, that they would do all they can to aid Ukraine with defensive weapons, but there would not be any intrusion of NATO forces into the battlefield. And I think that's probably what will happen. I cannot imagine that there would be intervention. It is possible, I suppose, that the war could spill over the border, perhaps into Poland. But I kind of doubt that would happen, because I think Russians are being careful, at least so far, to hit military targets and to focus on major Ukrainian cities, particularly Kiev and Kharkiv. So I think it's unlikely that it would develop into a third world war. And yet, Biden has been quite strong. He's taken quite a strong line. And as far as sanctions go, he probably couldn't do a lot more than he has done. But at the same time, it seems pathetically inadequate given what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. And I think many Ukrainians feel the same way.
Yeah. And what about for us here in North America? What does it mean for us? What does it mean for the rest of the world right now? How is it going to affect us? Will it affect oil and gas prices, the stock market, for example?
Yeah, and in different ways. I mean, the oil prices have already begun to skyrocket, whereas the stock market has begun to fall. And in Russia, it's had a catastrophic fall, as has the Russian ruble against the US dollar, is now at its lowest level ever since the ruble became exchangeable. So those things are already happening. But I think on a more serious note, China has stood by Russia on this one, and China's got its own territorial demands on Taiwan, and Hong Kong, I would say, would also fall into that same category. And the logic is, if this succeeds, there may be a tendency for powerful states to take it into their own hands to carve out bits of neighbors' territory, which hasn't really happened since the Second World War. We've not had any major border changes in Europe since the Second World War. The state of Kosovo was formed in 2008, but that was an exception. And all the border changes that have taken place have been due to Russian interventions in Moldova, in Georgia, and in Ukraine. So I think this is a bigger step by Russia. They're not just trying to annex or grant independence to the eastern territories of the Donbass that have declared independence. They are trying to occupy key regions of Ukraine, and I suspect quite strongly that the goal is to replace the Ukrainian government in Kiev with something a little bit more amenable to Russia, put some pro-Russian opposition figures in power there, so that these leaders can then make a firm commitment that Ukraine will be part of the Russian sphere, that it will never join NATO, and probably that it will never join the European Union either. So I think that's basically why there's a broader danger today of what could happen if everyone just sits back and accepts this and watches while Ukraine is sort of brought to a standstill and its government replaced. And I think there's plenty of hope long-term that this could happen, because I think it's almost impossible for Russia to control Ukraine indefinitely if the population is totally opposed to Russian rule. And there are precedents. I mean, they tried very hard in Afghanistan for nearly 10 years to have a pro-Soviet government or pro-Russian government there and completely failed. And here, I think the same again. Ukrainians are looking westward and they have a different attitude to Russian mainstream, actually. They travel more widely than Russians. They see their future as in Europe. And although there's a lot of corruption in Ukraine, there's a lot of economic problems as well. Basically, Ukraine is much more democratic state than Russia is today. And I think they would like to continue that if they get the chance.
You'd mentioned sanctions against Russia. Do you think that those sanctions will have any effect on Russia and its choices?
I don't think they'll have much other than the postponement of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline from Russia to Germany. That is a source of future income for Russia, and there would be quite a substantial sum that's being lost while that is not operating. It's finished. In theory, it could start right away. But the Germans, to their great credit, I think, have postponed it indefinitely, given what's happened in Ukraine. I think otherwise, as long as China continues to back Russia and would take its oil and gas if the Europeans stop importing it, then sanctions cannot have a big effect. Because most of Russia's trade is with China and Europe, of course, but China is a huge partner. And China could have a big say in this as well. It's also the United States' largest trade partner as well, for that matter. So that's why I think it's more of an international problem, as long as China and Russia are following in the same direction, which is somewhat unusual historically, actually. But they both got leaders who are autocratic, dictatorial, and have shown a tendency to try to push people around and get their own way.
Do you think that China is going to get involved militarily in this? I heard reports that I believe Taiwan observed missiles or something from China earlier. Did you hear anything about that?
I did, and I think there is a possibility that if Russia succeeds without getting any major repercussions, then the Chinese would definitely be encouraged to do the same with Taiwan, which has been I don't know what you call it really, a problem for them for the past, since 1949?
A long time,
so you could
decades
say
for sure.
more than 70 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they would like to get rid of that problem, the nationalist government of China. At one time, Taiwan was quite powerful and was actually in a position to threaten China considerably, but now it isn't. Economically, it's powerful, but in terms of military power, it cannot really compete with China. So that could happen. I was going to say, I don't think China is interested in getting militarily involved in Russia. I mean, Chinese would like the whole thing to be over as soon as possible so it can continue to trade with both countries. That would be the ideal situation for the Chinese. But at the same time, they would like to see Russia succeed, just as an example of a powerful state getting its own way without running into objections through the UN. And on that note, I think the UN is also a huge problem because the UN Security Council cannot do anything as long as China and Russia have the veto power to stop it. And I don't know whether there ought to be some review of that Security Council and its permanent membership, perhaps even, for example, a rotating membership now. After all this time, after 1945, they've had these same 5 members with veto power, which actually includes Britain and France, which are not really great powers anymore. But Russia and China are part of it at the moment, and they will always be part of it. So the UN can do nothing as long as there's this veto power in its way. It doesn't really leave any major organization to intervene as a mediator, other than perhaps the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, of which Canada is actually a member. But that's not very powerful. It doesn't have any kind of military clout. And they've been in the Donbass for the past 8 years, and they've had a lot of problems there. And I doubt they could deal with the situation on this kind of scale.
I'm about out of time, but I have one last really quick question. Do you think that Russia would have anything to lose by staying out of Ukraine?
As Russian territory dating back to the 19th century or earlier, he doesn't regard Western Ukraine as part of this same structure. That is the area around Lviv, Ternopil, Ivano-Frankivsk, all these places that were only occupied after the Second World War by the Soviet Union. There is, therefore, part of Ukraine that appears different to Putin to the rest of Ukraine. I mean, I think Ukraine is an entity, should be accepted in its 1991 borders. But I think there is that possibility of a Western part of Ukraine organizing the Ukrainian exile government, if you like, or a government of its own, if the one in Kiev falls. I mean, that's a terrible thing to foresee or to anticipate, and I hope that never happens. But there certainly has to be something keeping Ukrainian statehood alive if the capital is occupied for the short or long term by Russian forces. So that's all I could answer on that one.
Oh, no, that's more than enough. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate your expertise and just coming on and giving us a bit of a broader view of all of that. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Dr. David Marples is a university professor of Russian and East European history at the University of Alberta. I'm Jeanette Roche on behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News. Thanks for joining.